Forget the jewels and the feasts. Standing in King James I's presence was standing on a razor's edge. Most people completely miss the terrifying, brutal reality of simply surviving in that Jacobean court. You see, there's one thing I discovered after diving deep into forgotten archives that so many historians miss. It wasn't what I expected, and it goes against all the conventional wisdom about courtiers of the homosexual king. It's something much deeper, something baked into the very structure of their daily existence, and once you see it, you literally can't unsee it. This is the key that unlocks the hidden desperation behind the smiles of the many loves of King James I of England. Hello, everyone. Tonight, we settle into the early 17th century, a time when a king ruled two countries, and whose personal proclivities dictated the lives of the men who sought the king's love. But before we begin, get comfortable, relax completely. Maybe shoot me a like real quick. And if you're not completely settled in, a fast comment telling me where you are located on the planet and the time of night you're getting to bed. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Close your eyes. Listen gently and let yourself settle into an immersive telling of the past. The early life in Scotland of the man known as King James VI and I was far from stable. Crowned king as an infant after his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was forced to give up her crown, he grew up without his parents, instead surrounded by a changing array of regents and tutors. This childhood environment was filled with political plots and frightening violence. These formative experiences instilled in him a firm caution and a keen desire for control. He learned early that trust was fragile and that power was uncertain. Consequently, he developed a strong need for close personal connections, seeking out individuals in whom he could place his faith, craving loyalty that went beyond the political dealings around him. He grew into a highly intelligent young man, known for his keen mind. Later, James would write books on kingship, theology, and even witchcraft. He came to see himself as a learned ruler, a peaceful king who preferred negotiation and diplomacy over war. This intellectual side meant he valued clever conversation and debate which could be stimulating both mentally and otherwise, if you get my drift. By the time James was 13, a defining characteristic of his court was his open affection for male favourites, the recipients of a personal devotion that often extended to the most private corners of his life. James's first attraction as a boy was to a man named Esmé Stuart. He stepped into the Scottish court of the young king on a cold September day, 1579, having just arrived from France. A cousin of James's father, Lord Darnley, Esmé was a man in his late 30s, sophisticated, worldly, and possessing a charm that was immediately apparent. He had spent years at the French court, a place known for its elegance, its refined manners, and its appreciation for art and culture. This was a stark contrast to the rougher, more austere Scottish noble houses, where practicality often outweighed polish. When he first appeared at Stirling Castle, where James resided, his presence was a striking change from the severe Scottish lords. He carried with him an aura of French courtly grace, a different way of speaking, of dressing, of moving. His clothes were perhaps richer, made of finer silks and velvets, emitting a faint scent of foreign perfumes, a subtle difference from the wool and leather common in Scotland. His gestures were more fluid, his conversation lighter, and more engaging than the serious, often humorless discussions James was used to. He brought with him a sense of ease and confidence that was captivating. James, who had known little outside the rigid confines of the Scottish court, was immediately drawn to him. The young king, accustomed to being lectured and advised, found himself listening, truly listening to Esmé, captivated by his stories of a world far more colourful and less restrictive than his own. The king found himself drawn to Esmé with an intensity he had never known. Esmé was older, a figure of authority and experience, yet he treated James with a tenderness and respect that was new to the young monarch. He listened to James's thoughts, engaged him in conversation about topics beyond statecraft, and seemed genuinely interested in the boy himself, not just the crown he wore. Esmé spoke to James not as a tutor or a regent, but as an equal, or perhaps a benevolent elder brother. He praised James's intelligence, encouraged his academic pursuits, and shared stories of the wider world beyond Scotland's borders. Tales of the French court, of diplomacy, of art, and philosophy. For James, this was a revelation. He felt a truly personal connection forming, a sense of belonging and understanding that had been absent from his life. Esmé offered a refuge from the constant pressures, a space where James could feel safe and cherished. This was a truly personal connection, a friendship that quickly deepened into something more. The young king starved for genuine affection, clung to Esmé, finding in him the father figure, the older brother, and perhaps even the romantic partner he had never had. The court began to observe James's demeanour changing. A lightness, a newfound joy seemed to enter his expressions whenever Esmé was near. He would seek out Esmé's company at every opportunity, his eyes following him across the room, a subtle but clear indication of his attachment. The king, usually reserved, would laugh more freely, his voice gaining a warmer tone when speaking with Esmé. James began to spend almost all his time with Esmé. They would ride together through the Scottish countryside, the wind whipping past their faces, the scent of heather and damp earth in the air, a sense of freedom in their shared activity. These rides were more than sport. They were intimate moments of escape, where James could speak freely without fear of being overheard or judged. They discussed books, theology, and the affairs of Europe, Esmé offering perspectives James had not encountered from his Scottish tutors, challenging his assumptions and expanding his intellectual horizons. Esmé, with his French background, introduced James to new ideas, new ways of thinking about governance and culture, broadening the young king's horizons beyond the often insular Scottish view. They shared meals, often in private, away from the watchful eyes of the court, where the conversation could be more relaxed, more personal, filled with laughter and quiet confidences. James found himself opening up to Esmé in ways he had never dared with anyone else. He shared his fears, his hopes, his frustrations with the restrictive life he led, the burdens of a crown he had worn since infancy. Esmé, in turn, offered comfort, advice, and unwavering support, making James feel truly seen and understood for the first time. The king showered Esmé with gifts and titles, quickly elevating him to the highest ranks of the Scottish nobility. Within months, Esmé became the Earl of Lennox, then the Duke of Lennox, a title of immense prestige, previously held by James's own grandfather. He was given lands, revenues, and a place of honour at the king's side, often sharing the royal bedchamber, a common practice for close favourites at the time, signifying the deepest level of trust and intimacy. James's delight in Esmé's company was clear for all to see. He trusted Esmé completely, sharing his deepest thoughts and relying on his counsel. Esmé's influence over the young king grew with each passing day, extending to matters of state, appointments, and even James's personal habits, from his choice of clothing to his daily schedule. Courtiers observed James's face light up when Esmé entered a room, a stark contrast to the often reserved expression he wore in the presence of others. Decisions of state, appointments to high office, and even the king's daily schedule began to bear Esmé's mark, signalling a significant shift in power dynamics within the court. This rapid rise, and the open affection between the king and Esmé did not go unnoticed by the Scottish nobility. Many of them, staunch Protestants, viewed Esmé with deep suspicion. He was French, and worse, he was a Catholic, or at least suspected of being one. He had, in fact, converted to Protestantism upon his arrival in Scotland, a pragmatic move to gain acceptance, but many doubted the sincerity of this conversion. They saw his conversion as a calculated act, a thin veil over his true intentions, a mere formality to gain access to the king. They feared he was an agent of the French crown, or, even more alarming, of the Pope, sent to turn their Protestant king towards Rome to undermine the hard-won Reformation in Scotland. The Scottish lords had fought hard, often with bloodshed, to establish the Protestant Kirk, a church independent of Rome and deeply ingrained in Scottish national identity. They had shed blood to remove Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic monarch, and they were not about to let a suspected Catholic influence her son. They saw Esmé as a direct threat to their religious and political order, a foreign influence that could undermine everything they had worked for, potentially leading Scotland back to Catholicism and French domination. Whispers of a Catholic plot, of Esmé corrupting the king, spread through the court and across the country, fueled by powerful preachers who railed against the king's unnatural affections and Esmé's perceived popish leanings. Pulpits across Scotland echoed with condemnations of the king's effeminate behaviour and Esmé's idolatrous presence, stirring up public sentiment against him. The General Assembly of the Kirk, the powerful governing body of the Scottish Church, formally protested Esmé's influence, demanding his removal and even threatening excommunication for those who supported him. Going beyond political manoeuvring, this was a deeply felt religious and nationalistic opposition. The resentment grew into a dangerous anger. The Protestant lords, led by figures like William Roughthven, Earl of Gowrie, and John Erskine, Earl of Mar, could not stand to see their young king so completely under the sway of a man they distrusted. These were men who had themselves played significant roles in the turbulent politics of James's minority, accustomed to wielding power and influence, seeing themselves as the rightful guardians of the king and the kingdom. They felt their traditional rights to counsel the king, to distribute patronage and to shape policy were being usurped by this newcomer, a man with no established Scottish lineage or claim to their loyalty. They believed James was being led astray, that his judgment was clouded by his affection for Esmé, making him unfit to rule effectively. They saw their own power diminishing, their access to the king blocked by this newcomer who now held the keys to royal favour. The king's open favouritism towards Esmé meant that traditional channels of patronage and influence were disrupted, threatening the established order and the financial prospects of many noble families who relied on royal appointments and grants. The tension in the court became almost palpable. A thick, uncomfortable atmosphere of unspoken grievances and simmering plots filled the air. The older, more traditional nobility felt sidelined, their years of service and lineage counting for little against the king's sudden, intense attachment to Esmé. They feared for the future of Scotland, for the stability of the Protestant faith, and for their own positions in a court dominated by a foreign favourite. They believed drastic action was needed to rescue the king from Esmé's influence and restore the traditional balance of power. The situation came to a head in August 1582, a moment that would forever change James's understanding of power and loyalty, a harsh awakening to the realities of his kingship. While James was on a hunting trip, a common royal pastime that offered a sense of freedom and escape from the confines of court, he was lured to Roughthven Castle, the home of the Earl of Gowrie. The invitation seemed innocent enough, a chance for sport and a brief stay at a nobleman's estate, away from the watchful eyes of Edinburgh. James, perhaps seeking a brief respite with Esmé and a few trusted companions, accepted, looking forward to the fresh air and the thrill of the chase. As he entered the castle, a sense of unease began to settle over him. The usual boisterous welcome of a hunting lodge was absent. The halls seemed quieter, the faces of the retainers more grim, their eyes holding a strange, unreadable quality. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. James found himself surrounded by armed men, not his usual hunting party but a contingent of Gowrie's retainers, their expressions hard and unyielding, their weapons visible. This was clearly a kidnapping, a coup orchestrated by the Protestant lords, later known as the Roughthven raid. James was held captive, effectively a prisoner in his own kingdom, his movements restricted, his guards ever present. The castle walls, which had seemed a place of hospitality moments before, now felt like a cage. The stone cold and unyielding, echoing with the sounds of his confinement. The sounds of the hunt faded, replaced by the stern, unyielding voices of his captors, who spoke with a chilling formality. He was led to a chamber and informed, in no uncertain terms, that he was no longer free to leave. The lords presented him with a list of demands, a long document outlining their grievances, the foremost among them being the immediate removal of Esmé Stuart from court and from Scotland, along with a complete restructuring of the government to their liking, placing power firmly in their hands. James was heartbroken and furious. He felt a heart-wrenching sense of betrayal, a raw wound opened by the actions of men he had known his entire life, men he had been taught to trust. The men who had been his guardians, his supposed protectors, had turned against him, using force to separate him from the one person who had offered him genuine warmth and understanding. The air in the castle felt heavy with his helplessness, thick with the scent of damp stone and the tension of his confinement. He was a king, yet he could not command his own freedom, nor could he protect the man he cared for so deeply. He paced his chamber, his mind racing, trying to find a way out, but his guards were unyielding. The days of his captivity were filled with arguments, with the lords lecturing him on his duties as a Protestant monarch, and the dangers of Esmé's influence. They spoke of the threat to the Kirk, of Esmé's alleged popish designs, and of the need to purify the king's court, to save him from what they called corrupting influences. They pointed to Esmé's French origins, his Catholic upbringing, and the vast wealth and power James had bestowed upon him as undeniable evidence of his corrupting influence, portraying Esmé as a foreign agent rather than a beloved companion. James pleaded, he argued. He even wept, his frustration boiling over, his voice hoarse from shouting. But it was no use. The lords were resolute, their faces set, their purpose clear. Esmé Stuart had to go. The choice was desolate. Esmé's exile or continued imprisonment for the king with the veiled threat of even worse consequences, perhaps even a forced abdication. James, young and outmaneuvered, his spirit crushed by the betrayal, had no choice but to agree. Esmé, realizing the immense danger he was in, and under immense pressure from the lords, eventually agreed to leave Scotland. He made a public show of his departure, riding south towards the border, ostensibly on his way to France. Rather than a quiet, dignified exit, this was a forced march, a public humiliation, a clear message from the powerful Protestant faction that their will would prevail, even over the king's deepest affections. Esmé was stripped of many of his titles and forced to relinquish the vast majority of the lands and wealth James had given him, leaving him with little more than his personal belongings. He was escorted by a contingent of the Roughthven lord's men, ensuring his departure was swift and irreversible, preventing any last-minute attempts by James to intervene. James was left behind, consumed by grief and anger, a hollow ache in his chest where Esmé's presence had been. He wrote desperate letters to Esmé, expressing his sorrow and his determination to bring him back, pouring out his heart onto the pages, promising to find a way. He sent messages through trusted intermediaries, trying to find ways to reverse the situation, to orchestrate Esmé's return, exploring every possible avenue for their reunion. He even considered a military rescue, gathering what loyal forces he could, but his advisors, fearing further instability and civil war, urged caution, reminding him of his precarious position. The separation was a deep wound for the young king, a tearing away of his closest bond. He missed Esmé's companionship, his counsel, and the comfort he had found in their closeness, the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them. The royal chambers, once filled with shared laughter and quiet conversation, now felt empty and cold, echoing with his unspoken loneliness and the bitter taste of forced solitude. He felt the sting of his own powerlessness, a feeling he vowed never to experience again, a determination that would shape his future reign. Esmé Stuart, once the most powerful man in Scotland next to the king, found himself an exile in France. He tried to maintain contact with James, sending letters and messengers, hoping for a chance to return, to restore his position. Clinging to the hope of a reunion, he wrote of his unwavering loyalty, his desire to serve his king again, his longing for the Scottish court, but the political realities in Scotland were against him. The Protestant lords held firm, their grip on power tightened by the success of the Roughthven raid, and James, though he longed for Esmé's return, was not yet strong enough to defy them openly. Every attempt to bring Esmé back was met with fierce resistance from the Kirk and the nobility, who saw his continued absence as a victory for their cause. Esmé's health began to fail, perhaps from the stress of his exile, the loss of his position, the constant worry, or perhaps from illness, or a combination of both. He wasted away, a shadow of the vibrant, charming man who had captivated the young king, his spirit broken by the forced separation and the dashed hopes of return. He died in Paris in May 1583, less than a year after his forced departure from Scotland, far from the king he adored. For James, the news of Esmé's death was devastating. It confirmed the finality of their separation and underscored the powerlessness he had felt during the Roughthven raid, a cruel reminder of how easily his happiness could be taken from him. The loss was more than that of just of a friend or a favourite, but of a deeply cherished emotional anchor in his turbulent youth, a connection that had brought him a rare sense of peace and belonging in a world that offered little of either. The grief was inconsolable, a personal sorrow intensified by the public humiliation of the entire affair, a wound that would never fully heal. This experience, the intense love and sudden loss of Esmé Stuart, left a lasting mark on James. It taught him a harsh lesson about the limits of his own power in Scotland and the dangers of provoking the powerful nobility. He learned that, even as king, he could be controlled, manipulated, and separated from those he held dear. He learned that his personal affections, while deeply important to him, could also be exploited as political weaknesses by those who sought to control him. This event fueled his desire for greater personal authority and his determination to never again be a prisoner in his own realm, to be truly master of his own destiny. He began to plan his escape from the Roughthven lords, a plan he successfully executed in June 1583, just a month after Esmé's death, demonstrating a newfound cunning and resolve. He then systematically worked to consolidate his power, weakening the influence of the very lords who had dared to imprison him, taking back control of his government and his court. but it also reinforced his deep need for personal affection and loyalty, a need that had been so deeply met and then so brutally denied. The void left by Esmé's absence was a painful reminder of what he had lost, a yearning for that unique connection, that unconditional support. In the years following Esmé's death, James worked methodically to free himself from the control of the Roughthven lords. He managed to escape their custody a mere 10 months after the raid, demonstrating a cunning and resolve that surprised many. He then began the slow, deliberate process of asserting his royal authority, gradually dismantling the power base of those who had defied him. He learned to play factions against each other, to reward loyalty and to punish disloyalty with calculated precision. Yet even as he grew into a more assertive and independent monarch, the underlying need for close personal connection, for someone he could trust implicitly, remained. The emotional void left by Esmé was immense, and while he would never again allow himself to be so completely dominated by a single individual, he continued to seek out companions who could offer him a similar blend of intellectual stimulation, personal comfort, and unwavering support. It was into this evolving landscape of James's court that none other than Esmé Stuart's own son, Ludovic Stuart, arrived. Born in France in 1574, Ludovic was just 9 years old when his father died in exile. Upon Esmé's death, Ludovic inherited his father's considerable titles: Duke of Lennox, Earl of Lennox, Lord Darnley, Lord Aubigny, and Lord Methven and Torbaltoon in Scotland, along with the French title Seigneur d'Aubigny. He was brought to Scotland in 1583, a child returning to a country that had expelled his father. For James, Ludovic's arrival must have been a complex moment. Here was the living embodiment of his first great affection, a tangible link to a cherished yet painful past. James, now a young man of 17, likely saw in Ludovic a chance to honour Esmé's memory, to right the wrongs he felt had been done, and perhaps to recapture a piece of the emotional connection he had lost. The king took Ludovic under his wing immediately. He oversaw the boy's education and ensured he was raised in the Protestant faith, a clear signal to the Scottish Kirk that he was not following in his father's controversial footsteps. This was a pragmatic move, but for James it was also a deeply personal one. He was, in a sense, raising Esmé's son, shaping him, guiding him. Imagine James sitting with young Ludovic, perhaps in a quiet study at Holyrood Palace, the scent of old books and beeswax in the air. He would have observed Ludovic closely, looking for echoes of Esmé in his features, his mannerisms, his quickness of mind. There was a protective instinct, certainly a desire to shield Ludovic from the political storms that had engulfed his father. But there was also a yearning for a connection, a hope that this young man could, in some way, fill the void left by Esmé. As Ludovic grew, the relationship between him and James deepened, though it took on a different character than the intense, all-consuming infatuation James had felt for Esmé. With Ludovic, the bond was more fraternal, almost avuncular. James was older, more mature, and had learned the bitter lessons of unchecked favoritism. He sought in Ludovic not a passionate lover, but a trusted confidant and a loyal supporter, someone whose presence brought comfort and stability rather than the volatile excitement and anxiety that Esmé's presence had sometimes brought. Ludovic, for his part, seemed to understand the delicate balance required. He was charming and personable, but also discreet and reliable. He did not seek to dominate the king in the way Esmé had, nor did he provoke the same level of open hostility from the nobility. He was a steady, calming presence in James's life, a constant reminder of a beloved past, but without the dangerous political baggage. Their shared interests, helped solidify their bond. James loved hunting, a pursuit that allowed him to escape the confines of court and enjoy the outdoors. Ludovic shared this passion. Picture them on horseback, riding through the Scottish Highlands, the crisp air on their faces, the sounds of hounds baying in the distance. These were moments of relaxed companionship, where the formalities of court could be set aside. They would also have engaged in intellectual discussions, for James valued wit and learning in his companions. While Ludovic may not have possessed the same intellectual depth as James, he was intelligent enough to follow the king's often complex arguments and offer thoughtful responses. These quiet moments, away from the clamour of political life, were essential for James, providing a much-needed emotional anchor. Ludovic became a reliable fixture at James's side, a constant presence in the king's inner circle, a man who could be counted on for quiet support and unwavering loyalty. Ludovic Stuart quickly became a key figure in the Scottish nobility in spite of his inherited titles. Rather, it was because of his close relationship with the king. James bestowed upon him significant offices, demonstrating his immense trust. Ludovic was appointed Lord High Admiral of Scotland, an important role in a maritime nation. He also served as keeper of Dumbarton Castle, a strategic fortress, and later as Lord High Steward for the baptism of Prince Henry, a ceremonial but important position that placed him at the heart of royal events. These appointments gave Ludovic real power and influence, but always within the framework of loyal service to the king. He was seen as the king's man, as well as a bridge between the king and the sometimes fractious Scottish nobility. One of Ludovic's most important roles was that of a moderating influence. The Scottish court remained a place of intense rivalries even after James had asserted more control. Nobles constantly vied for power, land and royal favour, leading to disputes and sometimes outright feuds. Ludovic, with his calm demeanour and trusted position, often acted as a mediator, helping to smooth over disagreements and prevent conflicts from escalating. Imagine a tense meeting, voices rising, accusations flying, and then Ludovic, with a quiet word or a well-timed intervention, bringing a measure of calm to the proceedings. He was a voice of reason, someone who could be relied upon to offer balanced advice, free from the personal ambitions that often clouded the judgment of other courtiers. He understood James's temperament and could often anticipate his reactions, allowing him to subtly steer conversations or diffuse potential confrontations. He was a loyal supporter, but his loyalty was expressed through steady, practical service, rather than dramatic displays of affection or aggressive pursuit of personal gain. The nature of James's relationship with Ludovic was a clear contrast to the intense, almost obsessive infatuation he had held for Esmé. With Esmé, James had been a vulnerable, emotionally dependent youth, easily swayed by the charismatic older man. The relationship had been passionate, perhaps even romantic or erotic, and certainly all-consuming. With Ludovic, James was a more mature king, still deeply needing affection, but also more aware of the political dangers of unchecked favoritism. Their bond was based on deep loyalty and shared history, a quiet, enduring affection that had grown over decades. It was a relationship of comfort and trust, rather than the volatile intensity of his first great love. Ludovic never achieved the exclusive dominance over the king that Esmé had, nor the later, almost co-regent power wielded by future courtiers like Robert Carr or the infamous George Villiers, both of who have their own stories of the dangerous cost of proximity to power, where even the most favoured lived on a knife edge. But don't worry, you'll hear more about them later if you're still awake. And if you do drift off before then, you can always come back tomorrow night to resume the terrifying tales of the brutal reality of the lovers of King James I of England. Ludovic was a pillar of stability, a constant presence, but he understood his place within the larger framework of the court. He was a trusted friend, a reliable advisor, but not the singular focus of James's emotional or political world. When James finally ascended to the English throne in 1603, after the death of Queen Elizabeth I, Ludovic Stuart was among the very first to accompany him south. This was a powerful statement of their enduring bond. As James made his way from Edinburgh to London, a grand procession that stretched for weeks, Ludovic was at his side, a familiar face amidst the new English courtiers who flocked to greet their new king. The move to England brought new challenges and new opportunities for James. The English court was larger, wealthier, and more sophisticated than the Scottish one. It also presented a new set of political players, eager to gain the king's favour. Ludovic continued to hold high office, serving as a gentleman of the bedchamber, a position that gave him intimate access to the king. He was also appointed Lord Steward of the household, a significant administrative role that placed him in charge of the royal domestic arrangements. In England, Ludovic continued to be a moderating influence. The English court, like the Scottish one, was rife with factionalism and competition. As new favourites emerged, those who willingly took to the king's bed, Ludovic remained a steady, calm presence. He did not engage in the same fierce rivalries as others, choosing instead to maintain his quiet loyalty and offer counsel when asked. He was a voice of experience, a reminder of James's Scottish past, and a clear example of enduring fidelity. While others rose and fell, Ludovic remained a constant, his position secure not through aggressive ambition, but through decades of quiet service and unwavering devotion to the king. He was a man of integrity, respected by many, even those who disliked the king's other favourites. His presence offered James a sense of continuity and comfort, a link to his earlier, formative years. The relationship endured stably until Ludovic's death in 1624. He was one of the few figures from James's early Scottish court who remained consistently close to the king throughout his entire reign in both Scotland and England. His loyalty never wavered, even as other favourites appeared, dominated, and sometimes fell from grace. Ludovic's death, just a year before James's own passing, must have been a deeply felt loss for the king. It marked the end of an era, the loss of one of his oldest and most trusted companions, a man who had been a constant in a life often marked by change and uncertainty. The bond with Ludovic was a quiet anchor for James, providing emotional stability and a sense of continuity. It showed that while James could be intensely infatuated, he also valued and maintained deep, long-lasting relationships built on trust and shared experience. Ludovic Stuart's steady presence highlights a different facet of James's emotional needs, a desire for enduring, reliable companionship that could weather the storms of court politics and the king's own shifting affections. His life at court, serving James from boyhood to old age, stands as a quiet counterpoint to the more dramatic, volatile stories of other favourites, a clear example of a different kind of royal bond. As it was, Ludovic Stuart's steady, quiet presence offered King James a deep and enduring friendship, a kind of companionship, a link to a cherished past without the sharp edges of political danger. The king's court, however, was a place of constant change, a stage where new faces arrived, eager to capture the monarch's eye. And so, in the late 1590s, while still in Scotland, another young man stepped into the spotlight, drawing the 33-year-old king's gaze with an intensity that promised both great reward and immense risk. This was Alexander Roughthven, Master of Roughthven, younger son of the powerful William Roughthven, 1st Earl of Gowrie, and brother to John, the 3rd Earl. Alexander was first noticed in the Scottish court around 1599. He was younger than many of the established courtiers, perhaps around 19 or 20. His youth stood out, but it was his bearing that truly caught attention. He moved with a quiet confidence, a natural grace that spoke of noble birth and a certain self-possession. He was handsome, undeniably so, with features that conveyed intelligence and a lean, athletic build. Observers noted him from across a crowded hall, perhaps during a royal audience or a casual gathering. The atmosphere was typical of the court, a mix of various scents and sounds, but Alexander seemed to possess an air of freshness that set him apart. He entered James's inner circle with remarkable speed. It was not a slow, gradual climb like some. One day he was simply there. Then he was closer. Then he was always there. He was seen at the king's elbow during discussions, his head inclined, listening intently. The king's gaze lingered on him, showing a particular warmth in James's often shifty eyes. There were whispers, of course. The court thrived on whispers, on the subtle currents of favour and disfavour. Hushed comments were heard about Alexander's appearance, about the king's obvious delight in his company. A sense of apprehension, perhaps envy, perhaps a cold premonition settled within the observer. The rules of this game were understood. The meaning of this kind of attention was clear. Alexander was soon appointed a gentleman of the bedchamber. This position granted him exceptional physical closeness to the king, especially at night. It was a role of immense privilege, yet also one of constant, suffocating proximity. One could imagine the king's private quarters, the heavy velvet curtains drawn, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls. The air there was distinct, perhaps with the scent of the king's own body, a mix of musk and the faint aroma of unwashed linen. Contemporary accounts, those hushed chronicles passed between courtiers, explicitly noted that Alexander often shared the king's bed. This was heard, and knowing glances were exchanged. Bed sharing among men for warmth or convenience was not unheard of in this era, especially on journeys or in cramped lodgings. But its specific mention concerning Alexander Roughthven suggested it was seen as something more, a sign of noteworthy intimacy, a closeness that went beyond simple practicality. The scene could be pictured. The vast royal bed, perhaps cool and spacious, now shared. The king, restless and prone to fits of temper, even in sleep, breathing beside Alexander. The lack of true privacy, even in the most private of spaces. Alexander was described as handsome, and he quickly became a special favourite and daily companion of James. This played out every day. He was always at the king's side, whether in council, on a hunt, or during a quiet evening of reading. He was the one who fetched the king's books, who poured his wine, who listened to his rambling philosophical thoughts. He laughed at the king's jokes, offered quiet agreement, and seemed to anticipate James's needs before they were even spoken. He carried himself with a certain composure, a quiet dignity that prevented him from appearing overtly arrogant, even with such immense favour. He seemed to navigate the treacherous waters of court with a calm that was both admirable and unsettling. Did he feel the pressure? One might wonder. Did the constant closeness, the never-ending performance, weigh on him as it would on others? An observer's internal world would become a complex mix of feelings. There was the undeniable pull of ambition, to be so close to the king, to hold such sway, to have access to such power. It was a powerful draw. But then there was the fear, a chilling sensation. Courtiers had seen how quickly favourites could fall. They had heard the stories of those who displeased the king, those who were cast aside. The higher one climbed, the further one had to fall. It was understood that such closeness came with immense risk. It meant one's life was no longer truly one's own. It meant one was utterly dependent on the king's fickle affections, on his unpredictable moods. The pressure to maintain composure, to always appear loyal and eager, to never show a hint of discontent or exhaustion, was immense. Observing Alexander, one saw a mirror of one's own desires and fears, amplified. As the months passed, a subtle shift began to occur in the court's atmosphere. The king's moods, always a barometer of courtly life, seemed more erratic. There was an underlying tension, a quiet sense of unease. More whispers were heard about the king's intimacy with Alexander, and also about political friction. The Roughthven family, Alexander's kin, had a history of strong Presbyterian ties and a reputation for independence, even for involvement in past plots against the king, including the very Roughthven raid that so traumatized the young 16-year-old James. This history cast a long shadow. Alexander was watched. Did he seem burdened by the king's favor? Sometimes, a subtle sign of weariness behind his composed smile was caught. He seemed to carry the weight of his unique position. Perhaps the constant demands, the never-ending need to be on, were taking their toll. It was noticed that the king, for all his affection, could also be demanding, even possessive. He craved constant attention, constant validation. Alexander was his daily companion, and that meant there was little time for anything else, little room for his own desires or thoughts. He was a gilded cage indeed. A sense of unease started to settle over the court. The atmosphere felt tense. Rumours of disputes, of disagreements between the king and the Roughthvens, were heard. The king, always prone to paranoia, seemed more suspicious than usual. He saw plots everywhere, real or imagined. The tension was felt in the way people held themselves, the way conversations suddenly stopped when the king approached. Something was amiss. It was difficult to pinpoint. Then came the 5th day of August, in the year 1600. It began like any other day, filled with the usual duties and anxieties. Courtiers might be preparing for a journey, perhaps to Perth, where the king was due to visit Gowrie House, the home of Alexander's brother John, the Earl of Gowrie. The king was in a reasonably good mood, perhaps anticipating a hunt or a change of scenery. A slight lift in spirits was felt at the prospect of leaving the confines of the palace, even for a short time. The journey to Perth was uneventful. The king's retinue was large, a moving spectacle of horses, carriages, and armed guards. Upon arrival at Gowrie House, the atmosphere seemed normal enough. The house itself was a grand, imposing structure, solid stone and ancient timber. The usual preparations for a royal visit were noticed, servants scurrying, food being prepared, the general bustle of a great household welcoming its monarch. The king was lured away from his retinue by Alexander, who claimed he had captured a mysterious man with a pot of foreign gold hidden in a turret. James, ever curious and perhaps a bit greedy, agreed to investigate privately. They were watched as they went, the king and Alexander disappearing into a secluded part of the house. A small knot of unease formed. It was unusual for the king to separate himself so completely from his guards, to go off with just one man. But Alexander was the favourite, his daily companion, so apprehension was dismissed. Then the situation escalated rapidly. From the turret room, a sudden, terrifying cry. It was the king's voice, unmistakable, filled with fear and anger. "Treason! I am murdered!" Chaos erupted, shouts, the sounds of struggle. Courtiers were caught in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. Guards drew their swords, courtiers scrambled. More shouts were heard, the sounds of conflict. Hearts raced. Was the king truly being attacked? Was this a genuine plot? Or was it something else? Something even more sinister? In the ensuing madness, Alexander Roughthven was killed within the turret room. The stories were heard later, pieced together from frantic whispers and official accounts. Some said the king himself struck the fatal blow. Others said it was John Ramsay, one of James's attendants, who rushed to the king's aid. The details were murky, lost in the terror of the moment. Downstairs, John Roughthven, the third Earl of Gowrie, Alexander's brother, was also killed by members of James's party. The house, moments ago, a place of royal welcome, was now a scene of bloody carnage. The aftermath was marked by a heavy silence, broken only by ragged breaths and the distant cries of the wounded. The immediate aftermath was a blur of panic and confusion. The king was shaken, visibly so, his face pale, his clothes perhaps dishevelled. He immediately began to push his version of events. This was a premeditated, treasonous plot, he claimed. The Roughthvens tried to kidnap or murder him. He was miraculously delivered from their evil intentions. His story was heard, repeated over and over, gaining a kind of desperate authority with each telling. But inconsistencies were noticed. The official story was immediately challenged by many. The Roughthven's allies, some foreign observers, even some of the king's own men, found key elements inconsistent or lacking proof. Why would the Roughthvens, seemingly in a position of favour, attempt such a clumsy plot? What was the real purpose of the captured suspect with gold? The king's narrative felt too neat, too convenient. Whispers and hushed doubts were heard. One's own mind became a battlefield. Was the king to be believed? Did one dare question him? The pressure to conform was immense. Courtiers were expected to repeat the official story, to express outrage at the Roughthvens' alleged treachery. To do otherwise would be to invite suspicion, to risk one's own life, one's own position. The king's fierce determination to suppress any questioning of his version was evident. Critics were executed, exiled. The message was clear: believe the king, or suffer the consequences. The fear of being seen as a sympathizer, of having one's loyalty questioned, was a heavy weight. The Gowrie conspiracy deeply traumatized James. He commemorated the date annually as a day of deliverance, showing his survival against what he insisted was a grave threat. He pushed for its remembrance in churches, demanding public thanksgiving. This event fueled his existing paranoia, making him even more suspicious of those around him, especially those with independent power or a history of opposition. The court became an even more dangerous place, where trust is scarce and loyalty is constantly tested. Despite the king's official story, other theories continued to circulate. The whispers persisted, circulating through the court. Some suggested a personal quarrel, a sudden, violent argument between James and Alexander. Could it have stemmed from a sexual advance, either made or rejected? Or perhaps a fit of rage from the king, triggered by a perceived slight or a moment of defiance from Alexander? The king's temper was well known, his affections volatile. This theory felt unsettlingly plausible. Another idea: perhaps James discovered a genuine but poorly executed plot by the Roughthvens. Their family history, their strong ties to a more radical Presbyterian faction, their past involvement in the Roughthven raid, all pointed to a family capable of challenging royal authority. But if so, why was the plot so botched? Why such a strange theatrical setup? Then there was the darkest theory, the one that caused deep unease, that James himself engineered the confrontation. that he used the pretext of the mysterious prisoner to lure Alexander into a trap, all to eliminate the powerful, potentially troublesome Gowrie family. They were a threat to his consolidated power, a thorn in his side. To remove them in such a dramatic fashion would send a powerful message to any other rebellious nobles. This thought that the king one served could be so calculating, so ruthless, was deeply disturbing. The ambiguity of the Gowrie conspiracy forever changed the atmosphere of the court. It was a constant, unsettling reminder of the hidden dangers that lay beneath the gilded surface. The heightened sense of danger, the constant awareness of the king's volatile nature, the knowledge that truth can be bent to serve power, all these things weighed heavily on the mind. Courtiers learned to be even more cautious, even more guarded. Alexander Roughthven, a young man of beauty and favour, became a bright, brief flame extinguished by royal power and murky circumstances. His story served as a stark warning. It showed the fragility of favour, the ultimate price of proximity to absolute power. He was a favourite, yes, but his closeness to the king proved to be his undoing, swallowed by a mystery that would never truly be solved. This dramatic event left a significant void in the king's inner circle. The king, ever in need of companionship, would soon find another to fill it, a man who would be a steadfast anchor in the tumultuous court of the perilous king. Now turn your sleepy mind to an easily forgotten presence in the life of King James VI and later the First, a man whose loyalty was a deep, slow-burning ember, warming the king's life for decades. This is John Erskine, 2nd Earl of Mar, a figure whose roots ran deep into the very soil of Scotland's history, a man who represented stability, duty, and an unwavering commitment that predated the king's own memory. The Erskine family were ancient, their name a core part of the Scottish crown's history. For generations, they had served as guardians, custodians of young monarchs, protectors of the royal line. One would have grown up hearing tales of their steadfastness, their quiet strength. Their ancestral home, Stirling Castle, was a kind of nursery for kings, a place where the future of Scotland was nurtured under the watchful eye of the Mar family. John Erskine inherited this legacy, this sense of responsibility, a calling that he willingly answered to. In 1572, John Erskine's father died, leaving him to inherit the earldom and his duty to the king. As a young noble, just 7 years older than James, who was then 6 years old, and Mar himself only 13 going on 14, Mar began his service under the title 2nd Earl of Mar as the king's nominal guardian during the monarch's minority rule in Scotland. Mar oversaw James's education, his daily life. He was a constant, watchful presence. Think of James, a bright but often sickly boy, grappling with his lessons, his mind already sharp, but his body frail. Mar would have been there as a firm, steady guardian. He ensured James received the best possible tutoring, fostering the king's intellectual curiosity. He would have observed James closely, noting his quirks, his fears, his burgeoning intelligence. Mar's internal thoughts during these years would have been dominated by a sense of duty. The weight of the crown, the future of Scotland, rested in his hands, embodied by this vulnerable young boy. He felt a quiet pride in James's growth, a deep satisfaction in fulfilling his family's long-standing role. This was a relationship built on trust, on shared history, on the very foundations of the Scottish monarchy. It was a bond forged in the crucible of James's difficult childhood, a bond of protector and protected. The nature of their relationship was fundamentally different from the intense personal infatuations James would later develop with younger men. With Erskine, there was no volatile passion, no sudden, consuming desire. Their connection was based on trust, on duty, and on long, consistent service. Erskine represented an older generation of loyalty, a steadfastness that was almost paternal. He was a constant, unshakable figure in James's life, a reliable anchor in a sea of political instability. You would have seen Mar as a trusted counsellor, particularly on matters of state security and the royal household. When James faced threats, real or perceived, Mar was the man he turned to for advice. Imagine those conversations. More than whispered secrets in a bedchamber. They were serious discussions in a council room, perhaps by a roaring fire, the king's voice sometimes high, pitched with anxiety, Mar's voice calm and measured. Mar would have offered practical, grounded advice, rooted in his extensive experience and his deep understanding of Scottish politics. He was a man who spoke his mind, but always with respect for the king's authority. The weight of such advice, the responsibility of guiding a young monarch, would have been immense. Mar carried this burden with quiet dignity, his loyalty unwavering, his focus always on the stability of the crown. A powerful symbol of James's deep trust in Mar came with the birth of his eldest son and heir, Prince Henry, in 1594. James entrusted his precious heir to Mar's care, sending the infant prince to be raised at Stirling Castle, just as James himself had been. This was the ultimate sign of confidence, a clear statement that James believed Mar was the most reliable, the most honourable, the most trustworthy guardian for the future of the dynasty. For Mar, this meant a different kind of service, one that physically separated him from the daily life of James's court. While the king was travelling between palaces, engaging with new favourites, and navigating the shifting sands of courtly intrigue, Mar remained at Stirling, a steady, unmoving presence. He was raising the next King of Scotland, a duty that consumed his days. You can picture him walking the castle ramparts, looking out over the rolling Scottish landscape, his mind filled with thoughts of the young prince's well-being, his education, his future. This was a quieter, perhaps more important duty than the flashy life of a courtier. It was a responsibility that spoke to his core values: loyalty, tradition, and the long-term health of the monarchy. As the 1590s progressed, a subtle shift in influence became noticeable. While Mar was always respected, his direct personal influence on James began to wane. You would have observed this change, perhaps with a quiet understanding. Younger, more charismatic favourites, like Alexander Roughthven before his dramatic end, began to capture the king's attention in a way that Mar, with his more traditional, paternal demeanour, never sought to. James was asserting his own authority more forcefully now, moving beyond the need for a constant guardian. Mar's role became more formal, less intimate. He was still a key advisor, still a powerful figure, but he was not a bedchamber favourite in the later sense. He didn't engage in the same kind of intense, personal competition for the king's exclusive affection. His power base was different. It was more traditional and familial, rooted in his ancient lineage and his lands, rather than dependent solely on the king's personal whim. Mar was associated with a more conservative, pro-episcopal faction within the Scottish Church, sometimes at odds with the more radical Presbyterian nobles. This political stance further defined his position. He was a man of principle, unwavering in his beliefs, even when they clashed with the desires of powerful court factions. His influence was built on a foundation of long-standing service and a reputation for integrity, not on the fleeting allure of youthful charm or the dangerous games of courtly ambition. He was a man of substance, not simply a creature of royal favour. Then came the momentous year of 1603. Queen Elizabeth I of England died, and James, her closest heir, ascended to the English throne. This was the moment James had long awaited, the culmination of his ambitions. As he made his grand journey south from Edinburgh to London, a procession that stretched for weeks, a spectacle of royal power and newfound wealth, John Erskine, Earl of Mar, was among the very first to accompany him. This was a powerful statement. It showed that even as James embraced his new, grander destiny, he still valued the old loyalties, the steady presences from his Scottish past. In England, Mar continued to serve on the Privy Council, the king's most important advisory body. He was still a significant figure, his voice carrying weight in matters of state. However, he never regained the central, intimate position he held during James's youth. The English court was a different beast altogether, larger, more opulent, filled with new faces eager to gain the king's ear. Mar, with his Scottish ways and his quiet dignity, remained a respected figure, but he was no longer the primary confidant. The king's affections, now free from the constraints of Scottish politics, would soon turn to new, younger favourites who would dominate his personal world. You can imagine Mar observing the new court, the dazzling masks, the lavish banquets, the fierce competition for favour. He would have seen the patterns repeating, the same ambitions, the same dangers, but on a grander, more extravagant scale. He was sure to have watched the rise of figures like Robert Carr coming up next, with a quiet, knowing weariness. He had seen it all before, in different forms. His own loyalty, however, remained unwavering. He continued to serve the king with the same dedication he had shown since James's infancy. He was a living reminder of James's Scottish roots, a link to a simpler, perhaps more honest, time. The relationship between James and Mar endured until Mar's death in 1634. Like Ludovic Stuart, who had died 10 years prior, he was one of the few figures from James's early Scottish court who remained consistently close to the king throughout his entire reign in both Scotland and England. His loyalty never wavered, even as other favourites appeared, dominated, and sometimes fell from grace in spectacular fashion. Mar's life showed not fleeting passion, but deep-seated duty and enduring trust. His presence provided a quiet anchor for James, offering emotional stability and a sense of continuity in a life often marked by dramatic shifts and personal betrayals. It showed that while James could be intensely infatuated with his younger favourites, he also valued and maintained deep, long-lasting relationships built on trust, shared history, and a quiet, unshakable loyalty. We shift now to English court, a hotbed of lust and love inextricably linked with the very apex of political control. It is the first decade of the 1600s, and the halls of Whitehall Palace stretch endlessly, adorned with gilded carvings and elaborate frescoes that depict classical scenes. The air, though still carrying the familiar sense of wood smoke from countless hearths and the lingering odour of unwashed bodies, is also often perfumed with exotic spices, the cloying sweetness of civet, and the richer, heavier odours of grand feasts, roasted meats, sweet wines, and baked confections. The sounds are loud, a constant hum of activity, the rustle of expensive silks as courtiers move, the clatter of servants carrying platters, the booming laughter of the king, and the sharper, more cutting whispers of English courtiers, eager to gain advantage, to climb the slippery pole of favour. This is a court ripe for a new favourite, a new star to rise in the king's firmament, a new focus for all the ambition and envy that swirls beneath the surface. Into this grand, competitive setting steps Robert Carr. He is a young Scotsman, perhaps in his early 20s, not from the highest levels of nobility, certainly not with the ancient lineage of a March. His family is respectable, but not powerful enough to command attention on their own in this new, grand sphere. One might see him as just another hopeful face in the throng of young men who followed James south from Scotland, seeking their fortunes in the richer English pastures. He's handsome, of course, with a certain easy charm, a pleasant demeanour, and a quiet confidence that belies his relative inexperience. But initially, he doesn't stand out among the glittering array of English lords and gentlemen. He's learning the ropes of the English court, a world far more complex and subtle than the one he left behind, a place where ancient rivalries and unspoken rules dictate every interaction. He's earnest, perhaps a little naive about the true dangers of this world, but with an underlying ambition that you, a seasoned courtier, can almost taste in the air around him. A hunger for advancement, a desire to make his mark. Then, in 1607, everything changes with a sudden painful accident. The court is at a tournament, a grand display of horsemanship and martial skill, held in the tilting yard outside the palace. The stands are packed with nobles, their clothes a riot of colour against the grey, often overcast, English sky. The air is alive with the roar of the crowd, a collective gasp and cheer with each successful pass. You hear the thud of hooves on turf, the sharp clang of lances meeting shields, the shouts of the heralds. You are there, perhaps watching from a gallery, the wind whipping at your cloak, or standing among the king's retinue, your feet aching slightly on the packed earth. The sun glints off polished armour, and the banners snap in the breeze, emblazoned with the crests of noble houses. The smell of horses and damp earth mixes with the excited murmur of the spectators, the sweet scent of spiced wine, and the faint metallic tang of sweat and effort. The tension builds with each charge, each clash, as knights vie for glory. Suddenly a gasp ripples through the crowd, louder than any cheer. A rider falls. It's not a graceful dismount, but a bad fall, a sickening thud that echoes even over the cheers and gasps. The horse stumbles, perhaps catching its leg, and the rider is thrown violently from the saddle. You see him lying still on the ground, a crumpled heap of silk and leather, his helmet perhaps askew. It's Robert Carr. He has broken his leg. The cheers die down abruptly, replaced by a collective intake of breath, then a worried murmur that spreads quickly through the stands. The spectacle has turned to sudden, grim reality, a reminder of the ever-present danger, even in games. What happens next is extraordinary, a moment that will be recounted and ruminated upon for years to come. The king, usually a figure of remote authority at such events, watching from a safe distance, reacts with an immediate, almost frantic concern. He doesn't send servants. He doesn't wait for others to attend. He personally rushes to Carr's side. Everyone watches, stunned, as the king, his royal robes brushing the damp turf, kneels beside the injured young man. His face is etched with worry, his usually guarded expression replaced by open distress. He oversees Carr's removal from the field, his voice sharp with command, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He might even touch the injured young man, a gesture of tenderness that is remarkable for a monarch. The scene is public, undeniable. The king's intense focus on this one fallen rider is clear for all to see. A ripple of surprise, then a dawning understanding, passes through the onlookers. This is more than just royal concern for a subject. This is something deeper, something personal and powerful. This is the moment everything shifts. James personally nurses him. Imagine the scene in Carr's chambers, in the days and weeks that follow. The king, the most powerful man in England, sits by the bedside of a relatively unknown young courtier. The air in the room is thick with the scent of liniment and sweat, mixed with the faint, sweet smell of the king's own breath. The sounds are the quiet rustle of bedclothes, the occasional groan of pain from Carr, and the king's own voice, soft and concerned, reading aloud from his favourite theological texts or engaging him in conversation about hunting or court gossip. James attends to Carr's needs with a devotion that borders on obsession. He brings him special broths, ensures his comfort, spends hours by his side, sometimes late into the night, neglecting other duties, other courtiers. It's an intimacy that shocks you. You've seen the king's affections before, but never so openly, so tenderly displayed for someone so new, so relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of the court. The king, who often seemed aloof, even awkward, is now doting, openly worried, almost consumed by this young man's recovery. The palace staff, the other courtiers, they all observe this unprecedented attention. Whispers begin, quiet at first, then growing louder. The king has found a new one. He nurses him like a son. More than a son, perhaps. The implications are clear, and the court, ever alert to the currents of royal favour, begins to adjust its sails to this new, powerful wind. The established courtiers, many of whom had served James's predecessor Elizabeth I for decades, watch with a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger, seeing their own long years of service and established connections count for little against the king's sudden, intense affection for this young Scotsman. From this moment, Carr's rise is dizzyingly fast. At age 21, he becomes the undisputed favourite. You see it play out day by day, week by week. He is always at the king's side, a constant shadow, a presence that seems to grow larger and more central with each passing hour. He sits beside James at meals, often sharing the king's own plate, a sign of extreme closeness and trust that signals his unique position to all who observe. He rides with him on hunts, his laughter echoing with the king's own, their shared passion for the chase a visible bond. He attends him in his private chambers, privy to the king's most unguarded moments, his most private thoughts. All petitions, all requests for favour, all access to the king's ear now go through Carr. You, like every other courtier, quickly learn that if you want something from the king, if you want to advance your own interests, you must first get to Carr. The queues outside his chambers grow longer each day, filled with ambitious nobles, desperate supplicants, all seeking an audience with the new power behind the throne. They bring gifts, offer lavish flattery, compete for a moment of his attention, a nod of recognition. You feel the shift in the court's gravity, the way all eyes now turn to Carr, not just the king. The old guard, those who served Elizabeth and expected their due, watch with a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. Their long years of service, their established connections, their ancient lineage, now count for little against the king's sudden, intense affection for this young Scotsman. The resentment is palpable, a low hum beneath the surface of courtly politeness. James's letters to Carr become famously affectionate. You hear snippets, sometimes read aloud by those eager to spread the news of the favourite's immense power, or perhaps you even catch a glimpse of the king's own hand, scrawling these passionate words. "My sweet child and wife," James calls him, "my only dear and sweet servant. I desire to live no longer than I may be a comfort to you. God bless thy sweet heart, and grant thee a long and a happy life." You hear these terms, so intimate, so unlike the formal language of state, and a strange discomfort settles in your stomach. To hear a king, the head of church and state, use such intimate, almost marital, language for a young male courtier is unsettling. It's public knowledge, openly discussed, and it solidifies Carr's position in a way no political appointment ever could. It shows the depth of the king's personal attachment, an attachment that now dictates the flow of power, making it clear that Carr is not just a minister but a beloved companion. The language is an open declaration of his feelings, a challenge to traditional courtly norms, a sign of a king who cares little for outward appearances when his heart is engaged. The rewards come quickly, showering down on Carr like a golden rain, transforming him from a relatively minor gentleman into one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the kingdom. He is granted titles, lands, and immense wealth. You watch as he sheds his earlier, simpler clothes for silks and velvets richer than your own, embroidered with gold thread, adorned with pearls and precious stones. Jewels gleam on his fingers, around his neck, catching the candlelight, reflecting his newfound status. He is given vast estates, their revenues swelling his coffers, making him a truly formidable figure. The speed of his accumulation of riches is breathtaking, a clear sign of the king's boundless generosity towards him, a generosity that seems to know no bounds. In 1611, he is created Viscount Rochester, a grand title that elevates him into the peerage, giving him a seat in the House of Lords, a voice in the highest legislative body. 2 years later, in 1613, he becomes the Earl of Somerset, a position of even greater prestige and power, placing him among the most senior nobles of the realm. He is made Lord Chamberlain, a role that gives him control over the entire royal household, over access to the king, over patronage, going beyond a personal favourite. He now is a key political figure, a gatekeeper to the king's ear, a man whose word can make or break fortunes, including your own. He holds the keys to the king's chambers, decides who sees him, who gets heard, who receives royal favour. His power is absolute, seemingly unchallengeable. You feel the impact of his power directly in the subtle shifts of your own daily life at court. If you need a favour, a promotion, a grant, you must approach him, flatter him, perhaps even offer him gifts, a piece of valuable land, a rare jewel, a sum of gold. The feeling of being bypassed, of having your own long service and loyalty count for little if you are not in Carr's favour, is a bitter pill to swallow. You see the resentment simmering beneath the surface of courtly politeness, the quiet anger of those who feel their rightful place has been taken by this young, rapidly risen Scotsman. They whisper about his lack of experience, his humble origins, his sudden ascent, his perceived arrogance. They complain about his Scottish connections, his perceived influence over the king's policies. But you dare not show it. You smile, you bow, you wait your turn just like everyone else. The air in the antechambers outside Carr's rooms is thick with suppressed frustration, with forced smiles and thinly veiled desperation, a constant reminder of who holds the true power. Then comes the marriage. In 1613, Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, marries Frances Howard. This formal union is a resounding scandal, a public spectacle that captivates and divides the court, and indeed, the entire kingdom. Frances Howard is no ordinary woman. She is ambitious, beautiful, and already married to the Earl of Essex, a powerful and popular nobleman. Her existing marriage stands directly in the way of her union with Carr, and so a divorce is sought. This is where the true storm begins, a tempest of public outrage and moral condemnation. The divorce proceedings are a public circus, played out in the ecclesiastical courts, but with every detail leaked and discussed in the streets and taverns. Accusations fly, scandalous and salacious. Whispers about witchcraft, about impotence, about manipulation fill the air. Frances claims her husband, Essex, is impotent, unable to consummate their marriage, a claim that brings immense public shame to the powerful Essex family. To prove this, she even undergoes a physical examination by a panel of matrons, the humiliating details of which are widely discussed, adding to the sordid nature of the affair. The court is fascinated, everyone taking sides, gossiping in hushed tones behind their hands, eager for the latest twist in the drama. You hear the details, passed from mouth to mouth, each retelling adding a new layer of sensationalism, a new shade of impropriety. The king actively supports the divorce, pushing for it with all his royal authority, overriding objections from bishops and legal scholars. He wants Carr to have Frances. His involvement is a clear sign of Carr's immense power, a demonstration that the king will bend the rules, even defy public opinion, for his favourite's desire. It seems there is no limit to what James will do to ensure Carr's happiness, even if it means tearing apart a noble marriage and risking his own reputation. The wedding itself is lavish, beyond anything you have ever seen, a display of wealth and power, designed to overshadow the controversy. James hosts it, sparing no expense. The clothes are dazzling, a shimmering display of silks, satins, jewels, and embroidery so fine it seems to breathe. The air in the banqueting hall is heavy with the scent of roasted meats, sweet pastries, exotic fruits, and expensive wines flowing freely. Musicians play, their melodies filling the air, and masked dancers perform elaborate routines, their faces hidden behind ornate masks, adding to the sense of theatricality and perhaps a hint of hidden secrets. It is a spectacle of wealth and power, a celebration of the king's favorite, a bold declaration of his supremacy, a defiant gesture to all who dared to criticize. The king himself is radiant, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents of discontent, basking in the glow of his favorite's happiness. But beneath the glitter, there is an underlying tension, a sense of unease that permeates the very stone of the palace. You watch the bride and groom, their faces perhaps a little too composed, a little too triumphant, as if they are trying to convince themselves, as well as the court, of their happiness. You see the glances exchanged between the older nobles, the quiet disapproval in their eyes, the barely concealed sneers. Many feel that the king has overstepped, that this marriage, born of scandal and royal interference, is a dangerous gamble, a sign of the favorite's corrupting influence over the king's judgment. You feel a sense of foreboding, a premonition that such an extravagant display, built on such shaky ground, cannot last. The lavishness feels almost desperate, a way to paper over the cracks of controversy, to drown out the whispers of impropriety with a flood of gold and music. You wonder how long this golden age for Carr can truly endure, how long such a blatant disregard for moral and legal norms can go unpunished. For a few years, Carr and Francis reign supreme. Their power seems unshakable, their influence absolute. They are the king's closest confidants, the arbiters of all favour, the most powerful couple in England. Life at court revolves around them, their whims and desires shaping the daily routine. But then, as often happens in this volatile world, where fortunes can turn on a single breath, the cracks begin to show. The whispers, which had quieted to a murmur, begin to grow louder, more insistent, like a rising tide. The name on everyone's lips, spoken in hushed, fearful tones, is Sir Thomas Overbury. Sir Thomas Overbury was Carr's former advisor, a close confidant, a man who had guided Carr through the early days of his rise, almost like a shadow. He was smart, ambitious himself, and had been a constant presence at Carr's side, a key part of his success. He was known for his sharp wit and his keen political mind, his ability to advise Carr on navigating the complexities of court. But Overbury had strongly opposed the marriage to Frances Howard. Why? Perhaps he saw the danger in it, the scandal it would bring to Carr, the way it would alienate powerful factions at court and undermine Carr's political standing. Perhaps he was morally offended by the blatant disregard for legal and religious norms in the divorce. Or perhaps he was simply jealous, seeing his own influence over Carr wane as Francis gained ascendancy, fearing he would be replaced. Whatever his reasons, his opposition was clear, vocal, and it angered both Carr and Francis deeply. He tried to dissuade Carr from the marriage, even writing a poem, A Wife, which was widely seen as a veiled attack on Francis's character, a public insult that could not be ignored. His defiance was a challenge to the favourite's absolute will. Overbury ends up in the Tower of London. You hear the news, and a chill runs down your spine. Carr's hand is in it, everyone knows, though it's never openly stated. It's a clear act of vengeance, a silencing of a critic, a brutal display of the favourite's power. The Tower, that grim fortress with its dark, foreboding walls, swallows Overbury whole. You imagine the cold, damp cells, the isolation, the slow despair that must settle over a prisoner, cut off from the world, knowing his fate rests in the hands of those he angered. You feel a sense of unease, a growing understanding of the ruthlessness that lies beneath the polished surface of power, a chilling reminder of how easily a man can disappear. The air in the court feels heavier, charged with unspoken fear. If a man like Overbury, so close to the favourite, so politically astute, could be so easily disposed of, what hope was there for anyone else who dared to cross the powerful couple? Then the rumours begin, insidious and terrifying, whispers of illness, of a strange, lingering sickness that afflicts Overbury in the Tower. His health declines rapidly, far too quickly for a natural illness. The rumours grow, becoming darker, more specific. Poison. The word spreads like wildfire through the court, chilling everyone to the bone. The thought of a man being slowly, agonizingly murdered within the very walls of the king's own prison, under the very nose of royal authority, is horrifying. The secrecy, the fear, the eventual, terrible discovery, it all unfolds like a nightmare. The details, whispered in hushed tones, are gruesome. Strange powders, administered in his food, tainted enemas, the slow, agonizing decline of a once vibrant man, his body wasting away. The king, it is said, is initially unaware, perhaps willfully blind, to the darker dealings of his favourite, unwilling to believe that such evil could be so close. But the whispers grow louder, impossible to ignore. The truth, when it finally emerges, is a shock that reverberates through the entire kingdom, shaking the very foundations of the court. Sir Thomas Overbury was indeed poisoned, slowly, deliberately, over several months. And Frances Howard, Carr's wife, is directly implicated in the murder, along with several of her associates, including her uncle, the Earl of Northampton, and a number of servants who carried out the vile deed. The evidence mounts, horrifying and undeniable, revealing a calculated plot to eliminate Overbury, a conspiracy of chilling proportions. The trial is a public spectacle, a grim, captivating drama played out before the eyes of the nation, with every lurid detail exposed. The disgrace is absolute, the scandal immense, reaching into the highest echelons of power. The names of those involved are shouted from the pulpits, printed in pamphlets, discussed in every tavern and marketplace. The court is gripped by a mixture of horror and morbid fascination as the truth unravels. Carr himself is implicated by association. Did he know? Did he approve? Did he actively participate? The public speculates wildly, their opinions divided. His former closeness to Overbury, his eagerness for the marriage, his undeniable role in Overbury's imprisonment, all point a damning finger. He claims ignorance, but few believe him entirely. The king, James, is deeply wounded by this betrayal. His favourite, the man he called "my sweet child," is now tainted by murder, by scandal, by a crime that shocks the conscience of the nation and threatens to undermine the very legitimacy of his court. The fall from grace is swift and absolute. The king feels personally deceived, his judgment questioned, his affections mocked by the dark actions of those he elevated. His personal anguish is clear to those around him, a king betrayed by the very man he loved most. In 1616, Robert Carr and Frances are convicted of murder. The judgment is harsh, the public condemnation immense. They are imprisoned in the Tower, the very place where Overbury met his end, a grim irony that is not lost on anyone. Imagine the stark contrast. From the lavish silks and gilded halls of court, from the pinnacle of power and influence, to the cold, damp stone of a prison cell, facing the prospect of execution. From immense power and influence to utter disgrace and confinement, the isolation, the loss of everything they held dear, the constant fear of execution, the public shame, all must be a crushing burden, a torment, far worse than any physical pain. You watch their fall, and a cold satisfaction might mix with a sense of dread, a reminder that no one, not even the king's favourite, is truly safe from the turning wheel of fortune. Those who rise highest often fall furthest, and the court breathes a collective sigh of relief, but also shivers at the raw, unforgiving power that brought them down. Years later, in 1622, James pardons them. It's a sign of his lingering affection, perhaps, a testament to the deep bond he once shared with Carr, or a desire to avoid further scandal, to finally put an end to the painful public memory that continues to haunt his reign. But the pardon does not restore their former glory, their wealth, or their influence. They live out their lives in disgrace, stripped of power and influence, forever marked by the Overbury scandal. They are ghosts of their former selves, reminders of a time when royal favour could elevate a man beyond his wildest dreams and then cast him down into the darkest depths. They are a cautionary tale, whispered about in hushed tones, a grim warning of the perils of ambition and unchecked power. The King James is left deeply scarred by the experience. The betrayal cuts him to the core, a wound that will never truly heal, making him even more cautious and perhaps even more desperate for a new, untainted companion, someone who will not bring such public shame and personal anguish. But little did James know, his next love would exploit a deeply hidden vulnerability in James, one that would bring him to his knees, forever scarring his very soul, exposing the man behind the crown. His name was George Villiers, and he embodied both the peak and danger of royal favoritism. His relationship with James was the most enduring, politically significant, and personally intimate of the king's life. His ability to dominate a British monarch was truly unique, a feat unmatched by any other favourite. Yet, his arrogance, his policy failures, and the deep resentment he generated among the nobility and in Parliament would threaten both him and the stability of the Stuart monarchy. He remains one of the most controversial figures of his time, a man who soared higher than any other, only to crash down in a storm of public hatred. George Villiers enters this world in 1592, a younger son of minor Leicestershire gentry. His family, while respectable, holds no great wealth or ancient titles that would naturally propel him to the heights of court. He is not born into the gilded cage. Instead, he must earn his way in. He receives some continental polish, travelling abroad, learning languages, acquiring the polished manners and social graces that mark a man of the world. You can imagine him in France or Spain, observing the courts there, honing his charm, practicing his dancing, perfecting his horsemanship. He lacks the deep-seated connections of the old English nobility, the established networks of power that define so much of court life. He is, in many ways, an outsider, a blank canvas upon which the king's affections might be painted. His introduction to court in 1614 is no accident. It is a carefully engineered presentation. A powerful anti-Carr faction, seeing their opportunity in the brewing Overbury scandal, orchestrates his arrival. This group includes influential figures like Queen Anne, King James's wife, who, despite her own complex relationship with her husband, resents Carr's dominance and the public scandal he brings. Archbishop Abbot, a leading churchman, also wants to see Carr's influence broken, perhaps fearing his moral corruption. And then there is the Earl of Pembroke, a powerful nobleman who feels marginalised by Carr's monopoly on royal favour. These individuals, with their combined influence, conspire to introduce a new, untainted face to the king, someone who might capture his attention and break Carr's grip. They choose Villiers, carefully selecting him for his exceptional qualities, grooming him for the role. You can almost feel the tension in their secret meetings, the hushed whispers, the careful planning of every detail, from his clothes to his timing. James, by this point, is reportedly weary of Carr's arrogance. The Overbury scandal, with its gruesome details and public outrage, is a festering wound on his court. He feels betrayed, humiliated by the actions of his former favourite. He is ripe for a change, for a new face, a new distraction from the painful realities of his current situation. And so, when Villiers is presented, James is immediately struck by his exceptional qualities. You can imagine the moment of their first meeting, perhaps in a crowded gallery or during a royal reception. The air is thick with the usual courtly smells, the cloying perfumes, the faint scent of wood smoke, the underlying dampness of the palace. Then, your gaze, like the king's, is drawn to Villiers. He is extraordinarily handsome, universally acknowledged as such. His features are finely chiseled, his eyes bright and intelligent, his hair perhaps a rich brown or auburn, framing a face that seems almost angelic. This physical beauty was superficial, yet it was also a powerful tool, a magnet for the king's attention. Beyond his looks, he possesses polished manners, a charm that seems to light up the room, and a quick wit that sparkles in conversation. He is intelligent, able to engage in the king's beloved intellectual discussions, to follow his often complex arguments, and to offer thoughtful, engaging responses. He has an engaging personality, a warmth that draws people to him, a readiness to laugh and to flatter without seeming insincere. He knows how to listen, how to make the king feel heard and understood, a skill James craves. And then there is his athletic prowess. He excels in dancing, moving with a lightness and precision that few can match. You see him on the dance floor, leading a complex measure, his movements captivating. He is a master of horsemanship, sitting a horse with an easy confidence, controlling the powerful beast with subtle commands. You watch him on the hunting field, riding with skill and daring, keeping pace with the king. He is also adept at martial exercises, skilled with a sword, agile and strong. These are qualities James admires deeply, for he himself, despite his intellectual leanings, values physical strength and prowess, seeing them as kingly virtues. Villiers embodies these qualities in a way that Carr, with his more stolid demeanour, never quite did. He is the complete package, a dazzling combination of beauty, charm, and physical excellence, perfectly poised to capture the king's heart and mind. James's infatuation with Villiers translates into swift promotion, a dizzying ascent that leaves the court breathless. You watch, astonished, as Villiers climbs the ladder of power at a speed that defies all precedent, eclipsing even Carr's rapid rise. In April 1615, he is knighted as Sir George Villiers, a first step, but a significant one. Just 4 months later, in August 1615, he is appointed cupbearer, a position ensuring daily proximity to the king, allowing him to serve James his wine, to be constantly at his side, to whisper in his ear. This is an unprecedented step, giving him direct, intimate access. In April 1616, he became Viscount Villiers, a title that elevates him to the peerage, giving him a seat in the House of Lords. In August of the same year, he is made Master of the Horse, a prestigious and lucrative office that gives him control over the royal stables and a large retinue of men. Also in 1616, he is appointed a gentleman of the bedchamber, the supreme intimacy, placing him in the king's most private quarters, giving him access to James even in his sleep. In January 1617, he is elevated to Earl of Buckingham, a title of even greater prestige. And finally, in January 1618, he is further raised to Marquess of Buckingham. This pace of ennoblement is breathtaking, a relentless march upwards that leaves everyone else in the dust. You see the sheer scale of the king's devotion, his willingness to shower Villiers with every honour and office. As Buckingham rises, he and his allies actively fuel the investigation into the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury. This is a calculated move, a political weapon wielded with ruthless precision. They gather evidence, encourage witnesses, and ensure that every damning detail is brought to light. They know that the scandal surrounding Carr and his wife, Frances Howard, is the key to breaking Carr's hold on the king. They directly implicate Carr, now Earl of Somerset, and his wife in the murder, ensuring their downfall. You hear the whispers of their machinations, the way they subtly manipulate events, pushing the investigation forward, ensuring that justice, or at least a convenient form of it, is served. Carr's downfall is swift and absolute, a dramatic reversal of fortune. Buckingham supplants Carr in James's affections and bedchamber access. The king, already weary of Carr and the scandal, now has a dazzling new object for his affections. Carr finds himself increasingly sidelined, his access to James diminishing, his influence fading like a dying ember. The king's letters to Carr, once so effusive, become cold, formal, then stop altogether. You watch as Carr's queues of supplicants shrink, then disappear. His power evaporates, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. Carr and Frances Howard are convicted of murder in 1616, though spared execution and eventually pardoned in 1622, they are permanently banished from court, stripped of offices, and disgraced. Their names become bywords for corruption and treachery. Buckingham absorbs Carr's estates and political dominance, taking over his offices, his lands, his very position as the king's most powerful favourite. The golden cage that was Carr's life is now Buckingham's, but it is a cage of even greater splendour and influence. You see the complete transfer of power, the utter destruction of one favourite to make way for the next. The court, ever adaptable, quickly shifts its allegiance, turning its back on the fallen and flocking to the new rising star. Buckingham's power is unmatched. He was a favourite. He was, in effect, the king's other self, the true power behind the throne. As Ambassador John Chamberlain observed in 1617, the Duke of Buckingham is now, in effect, all. He controls access to the king absolutely. No appointment, no pension, or favour is granted without his approval. If you want anything from the king, you must go through Buckingham. His chambers are constantly crowded, filled with nobles, merchants, foreign dignitaries, all vying for a moment of his time, a word of his approval. You feel the weight of his authority in every interaction, every decision at court. This absolute control over access was about official business, and it spilled into every corner of the king's private life. Buckingham was a minister. He was James's constant shadow, his companion at every turn. You would see him at the king's morning rising, helping him dress, sharing quiet jokes. He would sit beside James as he ate, often carving the meat for him, a gesture of deep personal service. In the evenings, when the formal business of the day was done, it was Buckingham who would read to the king, or engage him in conversation, or simply sit in comfortable silence while James pondered his thoughts. This was an almost domestic closeness, a daily intertwining of lives that went far beyond the duties of any office. It was a partnership of souls, or so it seemed to the king, who found in Buckingham a solace he rarely found elsewhere. The strength of this personal bond is perhaps best seen in James's own words, preserved in his many letters to Buckingham. These are not the formal dispatches of a monarch to his minister. They are passionate, yearning declarations of affection. James called Buckingham his sweet child, his dear dad and husband, and signed himself, "Your dear dad and steward." He wrote of his desire to live no longer than I may be a comfort to you, and invoked God's blessing on Buckingham's sweet heart. This language, startling in its intimacy, shows a king who had found in Buckingham an emotional anchor he had sought his entire life. It was a love that, to James, was all-encompassing, a bond that blurred the lines of traditional relationships, making Buckingham almost a part of his very being. Because of this strong emotional connection, James became utterly dependent on Buckingham. This dependency meant that Buckingham's influence extended beyond mere policy. He could manage the king's moods, soothe his anxieties, and even deflect his rages. He understood James's vulnerabilities, his deep-seated paranoia, his intellectual insecurities, and his deep-seated need for affection. Buckingham became the master of the king's emotional landscape, a skilled navigator of James's often turbulent inner world. He knew precisely when to offer flattery, when to console, and when to gently guide the king towards a particular course of action. He was the one who could calm James's anxieties after a perceived slight, the one who could reassure him of his wisdom and authority, the one who could make him feel truly safe and understood. This emotional labor, though unseen by most, was a cornerstone of his power, making him indispensable to the king's daily comfort and mental well-being. James, for his part, tolerated Buckingham's growing arrogance, his occasional petulance, and his increasingly obvious policy failures. He would defend Buckingham fiercely against any criticism, dismissing Parliament's concerns or the complaints of other nobles as mere jealousy. You would see the king's unwavering trust, his almost blind faith in Buckingham, even as the court around them seethes with resentment. This personal devotion meant that Buckingham was, in many ways, immune to the usual checks and balances of court, his position secured by the king's deep, unwavering affection. The great extent of this emotional reliance meant that Buckingham held a unique sway over the king's decisions, both personal and political. James would often consult Buckingham on matters of state before anyone else, valuing his opinion above that of seasoned counsellors. You would see the king deferring to Buckingham in public, seeking his glance of approval before making a pronouncement, or allowing Buckingham to speak on his behalf with a confidence that bordered on royal prerogative. This created a dangerous precedent, as the king's personal affections became indistinguishable from the governance of the realm. The boundaries between private devotion and public duty blurred, leading to a system where the favourite's desires often dictated national policy, much to the frustration and alarm of those who believed in more traditional forms of governance. This deep intimacy also meant that Buckingham was exposed to the king's deepest fears and weaknesses, giving him an unmatched understanding of James's character. He knew the king's physical ailments, which were numerous and often debilitating. From early childhood, James suffered from weak legs, possibly due to rickets, a mild form of cerebral palsy, or a hereditary neuromuscular disease, causing him to lean on others and walk with a circular gait. In his later years, this progressed to severe foot pain and swelling, likely gout or arthritis, which increasingly limited his mobility and caused him great discomfort. Beyond his locomotor issues, he was prone to bouts of renal problems, experiencing turbid, red, or even bloody urine with sediment, indicative of kidney stones or chronic infection, leading to episodes of intense abdominal pain and fever. He also had a noticeable stammer and other speech difficulties, which some contemporaries attributed to a physical impediment or a neurological condition. Furthermore, he suffered from recurring gastrointestinal issues, including diarrhea and flatulence, especially during periods of stress, and in his final decade displayed signs of cognitive decline, including changes in his writing style, which modern historians speculate could point to small strokes or vascular dementia. Buckingham, being so intimately close, was privy to all these struggles, observing the king's discomfort, his moments of frailty, and his increasing reliance on those around him. This knowledge, while binding them closer, also gave Buckingham immense leverage. He could exploit these vulnerabilities, consciously or unconsciously, to maintain his position. The court, observing this dynamic, understood that challenging Buckingham was challenging the king's very heart, a perilous endeavour that few dared to attempt. The favourite was a shield, but also a lightning rod for all the discontent that simmered against the crown. He amassed a vast fortune through grants of lands, monopolies, titles, and cash gifts from James. You watch, astonished, as his wealth grows exponentially. He is given vast tracts of land, their revenues flowing directly into his coffers. He is granted lucrative monopolies on various goods, allowing him to control entire industries and extract immense profits. Titles are showered upon him, each one bringing more prestige and more income. Cash gifts from James are frequent and enormous, emptying the royal treasury but filling Buckingham's pockets. These homes are residences. They are symbols of his power, places where he entertains lavishly, further cementing his influence. You see the sheer scale of his riches, and you understand that his power is political and economic as well. This vast accumulation of wealth and power naturally drew a specific kind of individual to Buckingham's orbit: the sycophants. These were not necessarily men of great talent or long service. Instead, their primary skill lay in flattery, in anticipating Buckingham's desires, and in echoing his opinions. They formed a glittering, yet shallow circle around the Duke, eager to bask in his reflected glory and to pick up the crumbs of patronage that fell from his table. You would see them constantly at his side, laughing too loudly at his jokes, agreeing too readily with his pronouncements, and competing fiercely for his attention. Their loyalty was to the crown, and also to Buckingham himself. Rather, it was to the power he represented, and the rewards he could bestow. They were the parasites of the court, thriving on the favouritism that flowed from the king to his beloved Steenie. The king, for all his intellectual acumen, seemed remarkably blind to the true nature of these sycophants and the Buckingham clique they formed. Or perhaps, in his deep emotional dependency on Buckingham, he simply chose to ignore it. He might have seen their presence as a natural extension of Buckingham's importance, or even as a validation of his own choice of favourite. However, a subtle, almost unconscious, jealousy did exist in James. While he showered Buckingham with affection and power, he also expected absolute devotion in return. He wanted to be the sole source of Buckingham's greatness, the sun around which his favourite orbited. When Buckingham's family and followers became too numerous, too powerful in their own right, building their own independent networks of influence, it might have stirred a faint unease in the king. This was a quiet resentment that his sweet child was building a world that was not entirely dependent on him, a world where others might share in the glory that James believed only he could bestow. This was a king who craved to be the centre of his favourite's universe, and any perceived shift in that dynamic, even if it was a natural consequence of the power he himself bestowed, could cause a ripple of discomfort in his deeply complex emotional landscape. Yet, his need for Buckingham's companionship always outweighed these fleeting moments of jealousy, binding him ever more tightly to his supreme favourite. He holds key positions that give him immense influence over every aspect of government. In 1619, he becomes Lord High Admiral, taking control of the entire English Navy, a position of immense strategic importance. He is Lord Lieutenant of multiple counties, giving him military and administrative control over vast swathes of England. He is Chief Justice in Eyre, a powerful legal office. He is Warden of the Cinque Ports, controlling vital coastal defences. He sits on the Privy Council, the king's most important advisory body, and dominates policy, his voice carrying more weight than any other. He is the king's chief minister, his closest advisor, his constant companion. He is everywhere, his influence felt in every corner of the kingdom, from the highest councils to the smallest village. Buckingham's political impact is immense, and largely detrimental to the stability of the kingdom. He centralizes power, creating a Buckingham clique that dominates government. His family, his mother, his brothers, his in-laws are massively enriched and promoted, filling key positions in the court and government. This nepotism further fuels the resentment of the old nobility, who see their traditional rights and privileges usurped by this upstart family. You watch as his relatives, many of them lacking experience or talent, are given lucrative offices and high honours simply because they are connected to Buckingham. This centralisation of power generates intense jealousy and opposition from excluded nobles and parliament. His influence is seen as corrupt and detrimental to good governance. Parliament, in particular, grows increasingly vocal in its criticism, seeing Buckingham as the source of all the kingdom's ills. They accuse him of corruption, of selling offices, of enriching himself at the public's expense. You hear the debates in Parliament, the angry speeches, the demands for accountability. The king, however, shields Buckingham from all attacks, dismissing Parliament's concerns, further alienating his subjects. Buckingham increasingly dictates James's foreign policy, often towards disastrous ends. He champions ambitious, often poorly conceived, military ventures that drain the royal treasury and achieve little. For example, the Mansfeld expedition, a costly and ill-fated attempt to intervene in the 30 Years' War, ends in humiliating failure, with thousands of English soldiers dying of disease and starvation before even reaching the battlefield. You hear the stories of these failures, the waste of lives and money, and your heart sinks. Buckingham's arrogance and lack of military experience are clear for all to see, yet the king continues to trust him, to allow him to pursue these ruinous policies. The kingdom suffers, but Buckingham's power remains unchecked. In 1623, Buckingham champions a marriage between Prince Charles, James's son and heir, and the Spanish infanta, Maria Ana. The plan is ambitious: to secure a huge Spanish dowry, a vast sum of money that would replenish the king's depleted coffers, and a powerful alliance with Catholic Spain, a major European power. This is a bold diplomatic move, one that many in England, particularly the staunchly Protestant Parliament, view with deep suspicion. You hear the murmurs of discontent, the fears that such a marriage would lead to a Catholic resurgence in England. Then comes the unauthorised trip. In February 1623, Buckingham and Prince Charles travel incognito to Madrid to negotiate directly with the Spanish court. This is a bold, almost reckless move. James, who had opposed the trip, is left in England, anxious and worried, constantly sending letters to his dear boys, begging them to return. You imagine the secrecy of their departure, the disguise, the long, dangerous journey across Europe. Two of England's most important men, travelling without proper escort. Buckingham's role in Madrid is disastrous. He dominates the negotiations with characteristic arrogance, alienating the Spanish court with his swagger and his perceived disrespect for their customs and protocols. He is impatient, demanding, and prone to outbursts of temper. The Spanish, a proud and formal people, are deeply offended by his behaviour. You hear the reports filtering back to England, the stories of Buckingham's blunders, his insults, his lack of diplomatic skill. The negotiations quickly turn into a disaster. The Spanish demand impossible concessions, including the repeal of anti-Catholic laws in England, a condition that James knows Parliament will never accept. Buckingham grows furious at the delays and perceived slights, his arrogance turning into open hostility. The atmosphere in Madrid becomes increasingly tense. The match collapses spectacularly. After months of fruitless negotiation, Buckingham and Charles return to England empty-handed, having achieved nothing but a deeper animosity with Spain. The outcome in England, however, is unexpected. Buckingham and Charles, having returned from Catholic Spain without a Catholic bride, are wildly popular among the anti-Spanish Protestant populace. They are hailed as heroes, having supposedly thwarted a Catholic plot. You see the crowds cheering them, throwing flowers, celebrating their return. This sudden popularity, however, is built on a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of their failure as a triumph. The consequences of the Spanish match debacle are far-reaching. It deeply humiliates James, who had opposed the trip, and now sees his diplomatic strategy in tatters. Yet, it increases Buckingham's hold over Charles. The shared adventure, the perceived common enemy in Spain, forges an intensely close bond between the two young men. Charles becomes utterly devoted to Buckingham, seeing him as a friend, a mentor, a brother, and a confidant. Their bond is even stronger than James's had been with Buckingham, forged in shared experience and adversity. This means that, unlike any previous favourite, Buckingham smoothly retains his dominance under the new king, Charles I. He remains Lord Admiral, Chief Minister, and Charles's closest confidant. There is no period of uncertainty, no struggle for power. Charles simply accepts Buckingham's position as a given, a natural continuation. You watch, astonished, as Buckingham continues to wield the same, if not greater, power under the new monarch. He is the unbroken chain, the constant in a changing world. This continuation of power, unmatched for a royal favourite, sets the stage for even greater conflict. Buckingham's dominance under Charles I, however, is marked by escalating failures, particularly in military expeditions. His leadership of military campaigns against Spain, Cadiz, 1625, and France, La Rochelle, 1627, ends in humiliating, costly disasters. The expedition to Cadiz is a complete failure, with English troops landing, getting drunk on local wine, and failing to achieve any objectives. The relief efforts for the Huguenots at La Rochelle are equally disastrous, with the English fleet unable to break the French siege, leading to heavy losses and no strategic gains. You hear the grim reports of these failures, the stories of starving soldiers, ill-equipped ships, and incompetent leadership. The public grows increasingly frustrated, their initial enthusiasm for war turning into bitter disillusionment. Parliament, already resentful of Buckingham's power and his accumulation of wealth, grows furious. Led by figures like Sir John Eliot, a fierce critic of royal prerogative, Parliament relentlessly attacks him for corruption, incompetence, monopolies, and his dangerous influence over the king. They demand accountability, seeing him as the source of all the kingdom's ills. Attempted impeachments fail only due to Charles dissolving Parliament to protect him, a move that further inflames tensions between the king and his subjects. You witness the growing chasm between the Crown and Parliament, a chasm that Buckingham's presence only widens. Buckingham becomes the national scapegoat, blamed for military failures, financial ruin, and the king's misrule. Pamphlets circulate, openly criticising him, depicting him as a corrupt and incompetent villain. Sermons are preached against him. Public opinion turns violently against him. He is the most hated man in England, a symbol of everything that is wrong with the government. You hear the curses muttered in the streets, the angry shouts in the taverns, the fervent prayers for his downfall. The air is thick with public discontent, a dangerous atmosphere for any man, no matter how powerful. Then on the 23rd of August 1628, while organising another relief fleet for La Rochelle at Portsmouth, the inevitable happens. Buckingham is in a crowded room, preparing for the expedition, surrounded by officers and courtiers. The air is thick with the smell of canvas, tar, and salt from the nearby docks. Suddenly, a man steps forward, unobserved in the throng. It is John Felton, a disgruntled army lieutenant, motivated by grievances over unpaid wages, Buckingham's perceived incompetence, and the inflammatory parliamentary rhetoric that has demonized the Duke. Felton, driven by a desperate sense of injustice and a warped patriotism, plunges a knife into Buckingham's chest. You hear the sudden cry, the immediate shock. Buckingham stumbles, pulls the knife from his own body, and collapses, bleeding profusely. The room erupts in chaos. Shouts, screams, the clatter of weapons. Felton, surprisingly, does not flee. He stands there, appearing calm, allowing himself to be apprehended. The news spreads like wildfire, first through Portsmouth, then across the kingdom. The Duke of Buckingham, the supreme favourite, is dead. The public reaction is astonishing. John Felton, the assassin, becomes a popular folk hero, hailed by many as a deliverer, a man who rid England of its greatest oppressor. Ballads are written in his honour, celebrating his deed. You see the quiet satisfaction on many faces, the sense that justice, of a kind, has finally been served. The assassination of Buckingham is a shocking event, but for many, it is a moment of grim hope, a belief that with his removal, the kingdom might finally find peace. Buckingham's death marks the end of an era of unmatched favoritism. His life, from his humble beginnings to his rapid ascent, his absolute dominance over two kings, and his violent end, embodies the peak and danger of royal favoritism. His arrogance, his policy failures, and the deep resentment he generated ultimately proved fatal for him. These factors contributed significantly to the growing tensions between the Crown and Parliament, tensions that would eventually explode into the English Civil War. He remains one of the most controversial figures of the Stuart era, a man whose personal relationship with his lover, his king, had deep and lasting consequences for an entire nation. Well, if you've made it this far and are still awake, here's another video podcast to fall asleep to. Thanks for being here in the deep of the night.